Continuing on here with Chapter 3, Week 3, Material, Federalism. We're beginning with slide number 35. So, contemporary federalism, okay, from 1937 to the present. Two aspects, okay? First of all, it's a long-term expansion of the national government's authority from the 1930s to the present, okay? So, the national government today operates in many areas that were formerly reserved for the states and local governments. Okay, and a lot of this has to do with the influence of the progressive movement. Again, I'm not going to develop this too much, but FDR was strongly influenced by his cousin Theodore Roosevelt. Who was a progressive. He was very influenced by Woodrow Wilson, who was progressive, and a lot of the policies that he initiated took their cues from a lot of these progressive ideas. Okay. So FDR's New Deal, that was the name of his policy, it dealt with primarily the economy. Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s, President Johnson's Great Society, primarily dealt with social welfare issues with indirect constitutional basis. Okay, so the federal government started getting involved in social welfare. Again, this was stuff traditionally dealt with by the states. Within the Great Society, there were dozens of federal assistance programs, grants to the states for healthcare, public housing, nutrition, public assistance, urban development, education. Again, all of this was primarily a state issue. And LBJ began to basically nationalize these. Again, what's interesting about LBJ's Great Society, you weren't dealing with the Great Depression. And you weren't dealing with a war. In other words, America was actually really prosperous in the 50s and into the 60s, okay? After the war, man, there was an economic boom. So it's very interesting that LBJ championed that when there wasn't the lack and, the unemployment and all of the things in the 1930s. Kind of interesting. So contemporary federalism, okay, great expansion of national authority. Second of all, there was also something called devolution, okay? And this occurred in the 1970s with President Nixon, with President Reagan in the 1980s, okay? This idea of devolving power from the national government and kicking it back to the state and local governments, okay? So those are the two aspects of federalism in this time, okay? Pictures again might help you. Slide number 36, cooperative federalism. Okay, you can see Texas and the national government, shaking hands, kind of working together. Also, if you prefer food, if you're hungry, you can see the cake metaphor there. Instead of the layer cake of dual federalism, it's a marble cake where the flavors are mixed together. Okay, where the national government and the state government are both involved. Okay, in policy. The picture on 37, that's another example of cooperative federalism, where you see the federal government kind of punching down into the state. Think welfare, think national health care, think Medicare, Medicaid, think Social Security. In other words, things that traditionally state governments dealt with, now the federal government's getting involved. Okay. So again, what are characteristics of cooperative federalism? If you can go to slide number 38, you see additional information there. Again, joint policy is jointly funded by the national and state governments. It's jointly administered with states and localities providing most of the direct service to recipients and a national agency providing general administration. Okay, it's jointly determined. States still retain most of their traditional authority in education, health, public safety, and roadways, and yet the federal government is much more involved. In other words, an American in the 1920s would be shocked if they were teleported today, not just in all the tech advances, but if they realized the federal government's doing what? They're providing what? They're doing, in other words, it was very different. So let's go to slide number 39. Let's talk about some of the causes of federal government expansion since 1900, okay? I've kind of already alluded to this, but the first is the progressive movement of Woodrow Wilson and others created an administrative state, okay? The founders advanced this idea that there's a permanent understanding of just government based on human nature. Human nature is fixed and permanent. Human nature is depraved, so you had better limit government because government is people and people are flawed. Okay, that's the logic of the founders. And the progressives, again, they had a positive conception of human nature, so they felt that the size and scope of government can be increased because of a number of reasons. One, human nature is better, so if you give more power at the top, it's okay because human nature is good. Second of all of the advances of the industrial age was very different than the agrarian society of the founders. So the thinking the complexities of modern life warrants a new definition of government and the size and scope of government, okay? So they believed that government was becoming less and less of a danger because of historical evolution, okay? And because they thought that human nature was getting better. Go to slide number 40 again, additional information about the progressive movement. Again, when we're talking about this movement, it's not just an historical footnote from 100 years ago, but the progressive movement is still alive and very, very well today. I alluded to that. Hillary Clinton's a progressive. I would consider Bernie Sanders a progressive. I would consider Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez a progressive, okay? These ideas are alive today. And again, they're not just in the Democratic Party. There's examples of progressivism in Republicans. Again, George W. Bush 43 had some progressive ideas, in particular within foreign policy. So progressives, again, they took aim at the Constitution. They didn't like the separation of powers. They thought that gummed up the works. They thought that meant that government was inefficient. So you must eliminate the separation of powers. So they began to advocate an administrative state that they thought could do to basically engage in governmental policy without the hurry and the strife of politics. Okay, so they began to advocate that. They began to advocate an organic or a living constitution. Okay, they felt that the Constitution is not fixed and permanent; it's living, it's organic, and a lot of their thinking. They felt that the way you can begin to enlarge and manipulate the Constitution to make it do what you want it to do in every era is through the courts. They really felt that through the courts you could get that done. So the concept of the living Constitution has been embraced by many justices, many judges. And so, impatient for social change at the national or local level, judges will inject their policy preferences into their decision making and begin to cause the Constitution to live and move and breathe through their Supreme Court decisions. Again, I'll develop this later within the chapter on the judiciary, okay? But all of this led to an expansion of government, okay? The founders had no problem with the Constitution changing. They just wanted it done through amendments because, again, it was harder, it was more arduous, it demanded consensus, it demanded agreement from Congress and the states. Again, if 3/4 of the states have to agree to it, it's pretty obvious that the nation and the states want it, okay? So they wanted change to the Constitution, but they didn't want it to be easy, and they wanted it to reflect consensus, because once you bind everyone to it, you better make sure that they all agreed. Because again, if it's really true, the government derives its just powers from the consent of the governed, okay? You want it to go that way. The progressive movement kind of sidestepped that and said, listen, you can get a lot of change done through the courts. The good news is you can get a lot of change done through the courts. The bad news is it does not reflect consensus, and I would submit to you it is extra constitutional government, and it is non-republican in nature. Okay, it does not reflect the will of the people. A second reason that the national government has gotten stronger is the interdependency of American society. Okay, is that we're so interconnected with so many areas, with trade in particular, right? The economy, it's all interconnected. And then you throw in the internet and things like that, okay? That causes the federal government to step in and try to regulate a lot of this stuff, okay? Third of all, and this is really important, and maybe you've never thought about this, is Americans want government services. Remember the little section of the essay from Harold O.J. Brown, okay? Unless we control our appetites, we cannot control our government because government senses what we want more than our statements of, hey, we don't want more taxes, we don't want regulation, when we keep asking for different things, okay? So that causes government to expand, okay? You know, people like FDR, who was more progressive in his thinking, said that America has new rights, okay? There should be a new Bill of Rights for Americans. Needy people are not free people. People that have suffered necessity and wants through the Great Depression or times of war deserve to have their needs met, because if government does not meet their needs, it's the stuff of which dictatorships are made. Okay, we're going to read about that in the chapter on economic policy. But he advocated a second Bill of Rights that every American has a right to a useful job, a right to recreation, a right to a home, right to health care, right to good health, right to education, okay? And that has been in the water supply or the air supply of America since the 1930s. So if we keep expecting it from government, guess what government's going to do? It's not going to get smaller. It's going to get bigger to keep giving us what we think we want, okay? So that's where the entitlements have been institutionalized within our society, okay? If you're a politician, good luck trying to get rid of Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, school loans, Obamacare, right? Because once these things are given, if you try to pull it back, people are not used to relying on themselves to take care of themselves. They're used to going to the government for them. And woe to that politician who tries to modify it or reform it, okay? Because it's very interesting, okay? So that has led to the increase of the federal government. Another reason is number 4, if you go to the next slide, that would be slide number 43, the federal government's superior taxing authority, okay? States and local communities are in competitive situations for tax dollars, okay? But the federal government can basically, increase taxes, and it can actually print money, and because of that, it has greater power, okay? And the 5th reason for the expansion of national government is that the court has interpreted the 14th Amendment broadly, okay? By interpreting the concept of person in the 14th Amendment, which meant to be just for the emancipated slaves, broadly to include corporations and all kinds of other groups. Again, the more that groups look to the government and says, listen, I need my equal rights. I need my equal rights. I need my equal rights, right? The more people look to the federal government and the courts for that, guess what's going to happen? The national government's going to give it to you, but the problem is when the national government gives it to you, it gets its hands in more areas of the private sector. So that leads to an increase of the federal government. So those 5 areas have increased the federal government. So as I playfully say, this has caused the federal government to shift from looking like Luke Skywalker to Jabba the Hutt. Okay, so I'll stop there and I'll move on with slide number 45 next.